market recap on this Friday, the 17th day of October. It is the third Friday of the month, and typically we would have been anxiously awaiting the monthly cattle and feed report. However, with the federal government shutdown, NASS is one of the agencies that's currently on furlough or not working, and so that report wasn't published this month. Of course, this month would have been a quarterly report, and we would have got some numbers that we typically don't get every month, including the heifer and steer numbers on feed that might have given us some indication whether or not there was any retention taking place or not. It's very likely now that we'll be waiting until January's annual inventory report to get that number. Being the optimistic soul that I was all week, I'd been sitting here thinking that without that cattle and feed report, the bright side was there wouldn't be any Friday surprises to move the market. How untrue that turned out to be. If you follow any of the trade associations, following commodity brokers, or any social media at all, you would have seen there was quite the pile of headlines today that moved the market substantially, both grains and cattle. On the grain side, it was a bit positive. The cattle, however, definitely not the case, as cattle futures were just plumb ugly today. The good part about it for us here in Missouri might have been that there's very few feeder cattle auctions late in the week. Most of our auctions take place early in the week. There are a couple of feeder sales on Friday and Saturday, but for the most part, most of our trade takes place early in the week, so we'll at least have the weekend for maybe some of those headlines to fade away. Fed cattle trade this week ended up being highest volume number that we've seen in at least 2 months. As of the cutoff time on Friday, 76,269 head of confirmed negotiated sales. Now, there might have been a few more after the 2 o'clock cutoff time, but that's the numbers we had as of then. In Texas, 4,608 head. Of course, we haven't seen any trade in Texas for 2 weeks. This week's live sales reported at 240, and that would be $7 higher than the last reported market in that region. Kansas turned in 9,825 head. Sales there at 240, that'd be $5 higher than last week. Iowa turned in 29,734 head, 238 to 240, that'd be up about $5 from last week. Dress sales from 370 to 374, that was 8 to 12 higher. In Nebraska, 17,511 head turned in. Live sales there ranged from 230 to 241. It's about $5 to $6 higher than last week. Most of the sales around 240. The dress sales from 372 to 373. That'd be about $10 to $11 higher than a week ago. Box beef cutout values, 66 cents higher for the day on Choice, up $1.20 compared to last Friday. Choice closed today at $366.77. It's kind of been in a sideways slide since finding a bottom, it appears. Select up $1.34 for the day, up $3.88 for the week, closing on Friday at $350.27. Volume today, 188 loads of cuts, trimmings, and grinds, and the Choice Select spread at $16.50. Taking a look at what happened around the auction barns this week. On Friday, the CME Cash Feeder Cattle Index once again established an all-time record new high, 376.51. Even more impressive, perhaps, might be the Missouri Stocker formula. That's based roughly on a 550-pound steer through the auction barns in the state of Missouri. Of course, everybody knows that October's referred to as Dead Calf Month, and it's just absolutely unheard of to see the calendar year high for calves happening in the middle of October, and that's right about where we are. The Stocker formula on Friday at $437.39. That's up $13 since last Friday and only $2.10 below the all-time record. Taking a look at some stick-out sales from around the auction barns this week. These weren't necessarily the absolute tops at the auction barns, but it was some of the bigger impressive sales that stuck out with drafts over 20 head. Of course, some of the auction barns setting some barn records once again this week. At Callaway Livestock Center in Kingdom C, they sold 22 head of 440-pound steers at $531. Lolly Brothers Livestock Market in Macon, they sold 24 head of 520-pound steers at $519.50. The average statewide for those light 5-weight steers at $460. Kingsville Livestock Auction had 27 head of 568-pound steers at $466. Windsor Livestock Auction, they sold 83 head of 679-pound steers at $425. Joplin Regional Stockyards had 70 head of 726-pound steers at $411. That would have been a barn record for them. The statewide average price on light 7 weights this week at $390. West Plains Ozarks Regional Stockyards, they had 126 head of 855-pound steers. Of course, West Plains is way down in southern Missouri, dadgum near the Arkansas border, and they sold those 2 loads of 855-pound steers at $376.50, and that would be the highest 8.5 to 900-pound steers ever sold in the state of Missouri at any auction. Joplin Regional Stockyards, they sold a load of 903-pound steers at $359. Taking a look at some of the stick-out sales on the heifer side this week, Callaway Livestock Center sold 20 head of 500-pound heifers at $425. The average statewide on those light 5-weight heifers this week at $405. And then 162 head of 708-pound heifers sold at Windsor Livestock Auction at $389.75. The average statewide for all those light 7-weight heifers this week at $372. Taking a look now at the futures markets on the Mercantile Exchange for the week. Live cattle, October did manage to stay on the positive side, up $1.78. The rest of the months were 70 cents to $4.25 lower. Hogs were $1.43 to $1.65 lower for the week. And feeder cattle from $1 to $4.20 lower for the week. For the day, live cattle for October down $3.70, $240.25. December down $6.05 at $241.82. February $242.82, down $6.72. Feeder cattle, October was down $7.72 at $371.95. All the rest of the months closed limit lower. That's $9.25 now. November $371.70. January $369.70. Lean hogs for December, $82.37, down $22. February, $84.77, down $32. And April, $88.65, down $20. Turning our attention to the grain markets, at the elevators around the state on Friday, corn was steady to a penny higher, beans were up 8 to 18, and wheat a penny higher. Corn bids at the elevators in St. Louis, $4.35 to $4.36, Kansas City at $4.07. Soybean bids in St. Louis, $10.27 to $10.28, Kansas City, $9.64 to $9.84. Wheat bids, St. Louis, $4.78 to $4.91, Kansas City at $4.78. On the Board of Trade, for the week, soybeans were 12 to 14 cents higher, wheat was 1 to 5 higher, and corn 5 to 10 higher. On Friday, corn bids, December closed up 3/4 cent at $4.22.5, March up a penny, $4.36.5, and May at $4.45, up 1 1/4. November beans, 8 3/4 higher, $10.19.5, January $10.36 3/4, up 8 1/4, and March at $10.50 3/4, up 7. Wheat for December, 1 1/4 higher, $5.03 3/4, March at $5.20 1/4, up 1 1/2, and May at $5.30 3/4, up 1 1/4. Soybean meal for December up $1.10 a ton at $2.81 even, or that was up $4.10 a ton at $2.81 even. Soybean oil for December, 51.13 a hundredweight, up 26 cents. With the Missouri Department of Agriculture, that's a recap of your markets for this week. This is Tony.